The word appeared on Mara Voss's console at 0347 ship time, sitting inside a form field like it belonged there, like it hadn't just ended 83 lives with 11 characters in a period. Recovery status. Unrecoverable. She read it 4 times before her hands remembered how to move, and when they did, they didn't reach for the console. They reached for the stylus beside the authorization pad, picked it up, and set it back down without signing anything. 3 minutes earlier, the tactical display had shown her a debris ring the color of a healing bruise, wrapped around the collapsed husk of a star. The Concorde charts called Ocean's Wake, and everyone who'd ever flown near it called the choir, because the gravitational shear sang through hull plating in a frequency almost like voices. Buried in that ring, tumbling with the wreckage, was the colony transport Meridian Hail, 31 hours off a botched evacuation from Calder's Reach, its drive core dead, its hull holed in 6 places, its manifest listing 104 souls, of which 21 had already gone still in the cold before the distress beacon even reached anyone who could help. The remaining 83 were children. The manifest didn't specify why the adults had died first and the children hadn't. Mara didn't need it to. She'd flown enough evacuations to know that somewhere in that tumbling wreck, grown men and women had given away their air, their heat, their seats on the failing lifeboats right up until there was nothing left to give, and now a Yurthal actuarial engine 3 systems away had looked at the coordinates, the decay rate of the choir's gravitational shear, the treaty boundaries drawn after the hollow accords, and the current diplomatic temperature between the Concorde and the Threshold Compact, and it had returned a single classification that made all of that unnecessary. Unrecoverable, not dead, not lost, not even low probability of survival. Unrecoverable was a word for cargo that had fallen behind schedule, for assets that had depreciated past salvage value. It was a word designed to close a file, not to describe a person. Mara had seen it before. 9 years, 4 months, and, if she let herself do the arithmetic, which she tried not to, 16 days ago, on a different console, in a different ship, over a different wreck, that word had ended her daughter's file too. Elin had been 6 years old and asleep in a shuttle with a cracked heat shield when Command Actuary Systems decided that reaching her cost more than she was worth, and Mara had signed the form because she'd been 26 years old and terrified and had believed, God help her, that the people who wrote the rules knew something she didn't. She knew better now. She'd spent 9 years learning exactly how much they didn't know, one rescue at a time, and she had promised herself, quietly, without ceremony, somewhere around her 3rd year flying search and rescue, that she would never again let a form field decide the truth for her, before she'd gone and checked it herself. She did not sign the form. Commander Voss. The voice belonged to Fleet Liaison Administrator Kessa Thrain, projected as a slender blue-gray shape into the ready room, half a minute after Mara had ignored 3 separate priority pings. Thrain was Yurthal, 4.5 feet of economy of motion wrapped in the deep formal draping her rank required, and she had the particular stillness of someone who had delivered this exact conversation many times and expected it to go the same way it always did. You have not countersigned the stand-down. I noticed that too, Mara said. The actuarial engine's finding is not a request for your opinion. It is a resource determination. Sending a recovery vessel into the choir at current shear intensity carries an 83% probability of hull failure before extraction, and the treaty boundary established at Hollow Accords Article 9 prohibits Concorde military assets from entering the debris ring under any circumstance that risks destabilizing the collapsed geometry. That boundary exists because the last time it was crossed, 40,000 people died in the Varan evacuation cascade. The engine is not being cruel, Commander. It is being accurate. 83 children are in that wreck. I am aware of the manifest. Then you're aware the number the engine used to make its call was 104. It priced out the whole ship, not the 83 who are actually alive right now, because updating that number would mean somebody has to go back and check, and nobody's going to spend a scout run confirming a headcount for people they've already decided not to save. Thrain's projection flickered, the closest a Yurthal got to a wince. The margin of error in survivor estimation does not change the calculus meaningfully. It changes it enough that I want someone to fly out there and look before we close the book on 83 kids. There is no authorization for that flight. Then authorize one. I cannot. The engine has ruled. My hands are, in the most literal administrative sense, tied. I am not permitted to countersign a mission the engine has closed without a Tier 2 override, which requires evidence the engine did not have access to at time of ruling. You have none. You have a feeling, Commander, and feelings are not evidence. Then I'll go get you some. Commander Voss. Thrain's tone sharpened, and for the first time in the 4 years Mara had known her, something underneath the careful diplomatic register showed through. Not quite alarm, but its cousin. I am telling you this as a colleague, not as your superior. I have seen this look on your face before. 18 months ago, over the Halverson debris field. You did not sign that stand down either, and it cost you a formal reprimand, and very nearly your commission. I got the Halverson survivors out. You got 4 of the 7 Halverson survivors out, and the ministry has spent 18 months treating that outcome as proof the system works exactly as well without insubordination as with it, because 3 people did not come home, and the report attributes that loss unfairly, in my judgment, to the unauthorized nature of the attempt, rather than to the conditions themselves. If you do this again and it goes wrong, there will be no reprimand. There will be a court-martial, and I will not be able to prevent it, because I will very likely be sitting on the tribunal that convenes it. Mara looked at the wreck's last transmitted image, still up on the side display. A hull fragment tumbling end over end, a viewport lit from inside by emergency lighting, and behind the glass, for 1 frame before the feed cut, something that might have been a small hand pressed flat against it. Give me 6 hours, Mara said. I'll get you your evidence. And if I refuse to give you 6 hours? Then I'll take them anyway. And you can decide afterward whether that's a court-martial or a commendation, because either way, I'm not going to be the one who signed the form that closed 83 files without anybody looking first. She should not technically have been able to reach the Sparrowhawk's launch bay without her clearance flagging at the checkpoint. She did it anyway, because Chief Petty Officer Danelle Royce had been running that checkpoint for 4 years and had flown with her twice, and because he looked at her face for exactly 1 second before he waved her through and said, "Fuel's at 91%. I topped it off an hour ago on a hunch," which was Danelle's way of saying he'd known before she did that she was going to do something the paperwork wouldn't survive. You didn't see me, Mara said. I never do. He paused, hand still on the release panel. Wren. Her call sign, not her rank, which from Danelle meant he was about to say something he meant. 83 kids in a debris ring that's already killed 40,000 people once. You know the math. I know the math says don't go. I also know the math never once asked the kids what they'd want us to do. That's not an answer, Wren, that's a slogan. You gonna die out there proving a point to a room full of Yurthal accountants? Mara stopped, one hand already on the Sparrowhawk's ladder. I'm not doing it to prove a point, Danelle. I'm doing it because 9 years ago somebody told me my daughter was unrecoverable and I believed them, and I have spent every day since wondering whether that was true or whether it was just easier for everyone if I believed it. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life wondering that about 83 more kids when I've still got fuel in the tank and a corridor that might still be open. Danelle didn't have an answer for that. He hit the release. Bring 'em home, Wren, he said quiet into the noise of the bay doors opening. All of 'em if you can manage it. I'm going to try. The choir sang exactly the way people said it did, a low structural moan that came up through the deck plating and into her teeth. Gravitational shear translated into vibration, translated into something that felt, absurdly, like grief given a frequency. Mara flew the Sparrowhawk, a single-pilot long-range scout, fast, unarmed, built for looking rather than fighting, along the outer edge of the ring first, mapping the shear gradient in real time, because the engine's model was 3 hours stale, and 3 hours was long enough for a collapsing star's geometry to have shifted meaningfully. It had shifted. The safe corridor the engine had used to calculate its 83% failure probability had narrowed by nearly a third, which meant the actual number, if she'd been fool enough to ask the engine to recalculate, would have been worse. She filed that fact away without letting it slow her hands. 20 minutes in, a fragment the size of a shuttle bay clipped the Sparrowhawk's port sensor array, close enough that the proximity alarm screamed for 4 full seconds before her evasive burn cleared it, and she flew the next 11 minutes with a 30% hole in her forward scan coverage and her jaw clenched so tight it ached. She did not slow down. Slowing down meant giving the corridor more time to close. 40 minutes in, she found the meridian hail. It was worse than the last transmitted image had suggested and better than she'd feared, in the specific way that both things can be true of a disaster at once. The hull had sheared into 3 major sections, but the central section, the one housing the crew quarters and, according to the manifest, the makeshift dormitory where the surviving children had been consolidated for warmth, was largely intact, tumbling slowly, its emergency lighting still bleeding a thin amber glow through 2 intact viewports. She hailed on every frequency the meridian hail was rated for. Static, 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 and then, thin, cracked, unmistakably a child's voice trying to sound older than it was. "This is Petty Officer Trainee Osen Farrow of the Meridian Hail reporting. Is anyone receiving?" "Osen, I hear you. This is Commander Mara Voss, Concord Search and Rescue. I hear you loud and clear." Mara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "How old are you, Osen?" A pause. 14, ma'am. There's 82 of us left, not 83. We lost Tovin 2 hours ago. His suit." The voice cracked entirely, and someone else took over. Younger, quieter. "Is help coming?" Mara looked at the narrowed corridor, the sheer gradient climbing on her display, the fuel reserve that would get her in but had never been budgeted to get anyone else out, and she made the only promise she had any right to make. "I'm already here. They told us 3 days ago that a message went out saying we weren't—" The small voice hesitated, like the word itself was too heavy to lift. "That we weren't recoverable. Osen said that just means the grown-ups gave up counting us." Mara closed her eyes for 1 second in the dark of the cockpit where nobody could see it cost her anything. "Osen's wrong about one thing," she said. "I never stopped counting. What's your name?" "Ines," the voice said. "I'm 9. Inez, I need you to help me. Can you get everyone into the dormitory's warmest corner away from the viewports and keep count for me? Every 15 minutes I want somebody to say a number out loud on this channel, even if it's the same as last time. I want to hear you counting yourselves the whole time I'm working, all right?" A small fierce yes. Mara heard faintly Osen's voice organizing behind it, the particular efficient bossiness of a 14-year-old who had been carrying far more than his rank required for 31 hours, and had apparently decided he would carry it a while longer. The evidence she sent back to Thrain was not strictly the kind the engine was built to weigh. It was a live feed of 82 children, ages 4 through 16, huddled in 3 concentric rings around a single working heat panel, rationing air with a discipline that no 14-year-old should have had to learn. It was Osen Farrow's voice log, recovered from the ship's black box, documenting every adult death in order and the reason for it. Engineer Cade gave his suit to the twins in Bay 4. Captain Rusin stayed behind the blast door to hold pressure so the shuttle could launch. She knew she wasn't getting out. A ledger of exactly the kind of cost the engine had never been asked to price, because the engine only priced the future, never the debt already paid to reach it. It was also, Mara knew as she transmitted it, an act of insubordination severe enough to end her career. Because embedded in that feed was unambiguous proof that a Concord officer had entered a treaty-restricted debris field without authorization, using a Concord vessel, and was now requesting a full recovery operation to extract a head count the engine had already closed. Thrain's response came back 40 minutes later, and it was not what Mara expected. "Commander Voss." The projection in the Sparrowhawk's cramped ready space looked, for the first time since Mara had known her, genuinely uncertain. "You have given the engine information it did not have. Survivor count is 82, not 104. This changes the resource calculus meaningfully. A smaller extraction mass, a shorter dwell time in the shear zone. I am filing for Tier 2 override." "How long?" "Filing takes minutes. Approval." Thrain hesitated in a way Yurthal rarely did. "Approval requires a second signatory at ministry level, and the ministry does not typically expedite requests that originate from an unauthorized incursion. There is also," she added, And here her voice dropped into something closer to genuine reluctance. A complication above your clearance that will make this signatory very difficult to obtain quickly, and I do not know how to explain it to you without breaking an oath I have kept for 11 years. How long, Kessa? 8 hours. Possibly longer if the signatory has questions about how you obtained this footage. And they will have questions, Commander, because the choir is not merely dangerous. It is protected for a reason the public record does not contain. Mara looked at her fuel gauge, looked at the shear gradient which her own sensors, 3 hours fresher than the engine's model, put on a trajectory that would close the last viable corridor in just under 6. They don't have 8 hours, she said. I need a recovery vessel launched in the next 90 minutes or the corridor's gone, and it doesn't matter what the paperwork says. I cannot make the ministry move faster than it moves. Then I need something else from you. I need to know why the engine actually closed this file, because 82 kids and a shear gradient don't explain an 83% failure margin that's 3 hours stale on a decision this size. Nobody rounds a rescue vessel's odds down for administrative convenience unless there's a reason nobody's saying out loud. You just told me there's a complication above my clearance. Tell me what it is. The silence that followed was long enough that Mara checked her comm link twice to make sure it hadn't dropped. You should not ask me that question, Commander. I'm asking it anyway. What Thrain told her, in the careful, compressed phrasing of someone choosing every word for what it wouldn't reveal as much as what it would, was this. The hollow accords hadn't been written after the Varan Cascade, because a debris ring was dangerous. Debris rings were dangerous everywhere. The Concorde flew through worse. They'd been written because buried in the heart of the choir, sealed inside what remained of a pre-accord Yurthal research platform nobody officially admitted still existed, was a stasis containment field holding the failed remnant of an early attempt to artificially stabilize a collapsing stellar core. An experiment that had gone wrong in a way the Yurthal had spent 3 centuries quietly trying to forget, and that any sufficiently large mass moving through the ring at the wrong vector could, in theory, destabilize. The 40,000 dead at Varan hadn't died because a ship got crushed by debris. They'd died because a Yurthal rescue cruiser, 40 years ago, had clipped that containment field trying to reach survivors of exactly this kind of wreck, and the resulting cascade had taken out an inhabited moon on the far side of the ring before anyone understood what had happened. The engine doesn't calculate the odds of losing a rescue ship, Thrain said. It calculates the odds of triggering a second Varan. Every unrecoverable ruling issued for a wreck inside the choir since the Accords is the same ruling, issued for the same reason, and the reason has never once appeared in the paperwork, because acknowledging it means acknowledging the containment field exists. And if it's known to exist, someone will eventually ask why it was never properly decommissioned, and that question leads somewhere the Ministry has spent 3 centuries making sure it never has to answer. It is not merely 82 children being weighed, Commander. It is the entire architecture of a secret being weighed against them, and secrets in institutional terms are almost always calculated to weigh more. How many wrecks? Mara asked quietly. How many times has unrecoverable meant this instead of what it says? I do not have an exact figure. My estimate, based on classified engine logs I should not have access to and accessed regardless approximately 3 years ago out of a discomfort I have never resolved, is between 40 and 60 incidents since the Accords. Some had no survivors to argue for. Some, Commander, very likely had survivors exactly like the ones you are speaking to right now, and no pilot willing to fly past the word on the console to go and check. Mara sat with that for a long moment, the choir's low moan coming up through the deck plating. It was not, she understood now, one bad ruling. It was a system, patient and self-protecting, that had been quietly closing files on people for 3 centuries because the alternative was admitting what it was protecting and why. So it's not 82 kids versus a bad shear gradient, she said slowly. It's 82 kids versus a secret you're all still paying interest on. It is 82 kids weighed against the possibility, remote but not zero, of a second cascade that could kill millions on the settled worlds along the ring's far arc, layered on top of 40 to 60 prior decisions the Ministry has a considerable institutional interest in never revisiting. I am not telling you this to defend the ruling, Commander. I am telling you because you asked, and because I believe, for reasons I am only now admitting to myself, that you deserve to make your decision with the truth in front of you instead of a euphemism, Even knowing that telling you this may end my career as certainly as flying into the choir may end yours. Then tell me the real numbers, not the ones that protect the secret. The real odds if I fly a proper corridor timed right, mass budgeted right. What's the actual chance I'd trigger something? A pause, longer this time. Thrain, running the honest version of a calculation the engine had never been permitted to surface. Substantially lower than the engine's public figure suggests, if the approach is flown with precision. The engine's number was inflated to discourage attempts, not to reflect reality. My own estimate, using containment field specifications I am not authorized to possess, is closer to 4% for a single, correctly mass-budgeted vessel on a minimum disturbance vector. But 4% is not zero, Commander, and I want you to understand exactly what you would be risking if you are wrong. 4% of an inhabited moon is not 4% of a moon. It is the whole moon, or none of it, and there will be no partial credit for having tried carefully. I understand it, Mara said. I've understood it since the day they told me my daughter's shuttle was unrecoverable, and I believed them. I'm done letting a number I can't see decide who's worth going back for, and I'm not asking you to sign anything, Kessa. Give me the containment field specs off the record and let me fly the corridor myself. If I'm wrong, it's my hand on the wheel and nobody else's name in the file. If you are wrong, Thrain said very quietly, there will be no file left for anyone's name to be in. But I have spent 11 years believing the correct response to a monstrous number is a better number, not a closed door. I will send the specifications. Fly it exactly as I give it to you, Commander. Do not improvise even once. She flew the corridor herself because there was no recovery vessel yet, and the Sparrowhawk wasn't built to carry 82 passengers, but it was built to carry a message and a plan and, she hoped, enough time. She threaded the scout ship through the narrowing gap in the ring at a velocity that made the hull groan in sympathy with the choir's ambient moan, mapping a precise minimum mass, minimum disturbance vector as she went, and burning it directly into the nav computer for whatever ship came after her. Every adjustment she made twice. Once for speed, once to keep her wake, the literal gravitational and thermal wake of a starship passing through a field of debris older than most of the Concord's member species, as small and gentle as a held breath. Twice, the containment field's outer boundary lit up amber on her display as her trajectory drifted within its tolerance margin, and both times she corrected with a stillness in her hands that surprised her, because underneath the calm she was aware, with total clarity, that a mistake here didn't just cost her the 82 children she was trying to reach. It cost a moon full of people who had no idea their survival was, at this exact moment, riding on how steady one exhausted pilot's hands could stay. She reached the Meridian Hail with 40 minutes of corridor left, according to her own fresher model. And the Sparrowhawk had exactly zero capacity to take on passengers beyond its single crash couch. She hadn't come to extract them. She'd come because Osen Pharaoh and 81 other children needed to hear a human voice in the room with them, not relayed through 3 hours of institutional delay, and because some numbers only mean something when somebody's actually there to be counted. She docked the Sparrowhawk against the Meridian Hail's intact airlock, cycled through in a suit that hadn't been designed for anything but scouting, and stepped into a dormitory, lit amber and full of 82 faces turning toward her all at once, and she understood, in the half-second before anyone spoke, exactly what Unrecoverable had actually cost. Not a resource. Not a risk calculation. A room full of children who had spent 31 hours believing, correctly, that the adults meant to save them had already decided they weren't worth saving. Hi, Mara said, pulling off her helmet so they could see her face was real. I'm Ren. I fly rescue. There's a proper ship coming, and until it gets here, I'm not going anywhere. Osen Pharaoh, 14 years old, 3 days without proper sleep, looked at her with an expression far too old for his face. The message said Unrecoverable. The message was wrong, Mara said. I'm here to fix the paperwork. She had been aboard the Meridian Hail for 6 minutes when Fleet Command found a way to reach her that Thrain hadn't authorized. Commander Voss. The voice belonged to Vice Admiral Halden Corr, and it came through on a priority channel Mara hadn't known the Sparrowhawk could still receive from this deep inside the ring, which meant someone at Fleet had gone to considerable trouble to make sure she couldn't claim later that she hadn't heard the order. You are to disengage from the Meridian Hail, return to your vessel, and withdraw from the choir along your entry vector immediately. This is not a request. Admiral, I have 82 survivors in a dormitory with a failing heat panel and a corridor that closes in 35 minutes. I'm not leaving them here alone to explain to Fleet Command why I followed procedure. You are one pilot in an unarmed scout craft, Commander. You cannot extract 82 survivors, and your continued presence inside a treaty-restricted zone is, as of 11 minutes ago, the subject of a formal protest from the Threshold Compact Liaison Office, who have accused the Concord of unilaterally violating Hollow Accords Article 9, and are demanding an explanation before this becomes a diplomatic incident layered on top of a humanitarian one. I do not have the authority to explain to them why a decorated officer flew an unauthorized incursion into a debris field 40,000 people died crossing, and neither, frankly, does anyone above me, because nobody above me was consulted before you made this decision for all of us. Mara looked around the dormitory, Inez watching her with the unblinking attention of a child who had learned to read adult faces for the truth behind their words. Osen standing a half step closer than strictly necessary, the way you stand near someone you've decided you're responsible for protecting. 16 faces, 82 faces, all of them waiting to find out whether the promise she'd made held. Admiral, with respect, I'm not asking Fleet Command to explain anything to anyone. I'm asking them to let a recovery cruiser reach a corridor I've already mapped and already proven survivable before it closes, and the explanation becomes unnecessary because there's nothing left to explain. That is not your decision to make, Commander. No, Mara said, it isn't. It's yours. So make it. Authorize the thread right, or stand there on a secure channel and tell 82 kids on an open one that the reason nobody came was a protest letter. The silence on the line lasted long enough that she checked her oxygen readout twice, an old habit from worse moments than this one. The thread right has been reassigned under Administrator Thrain's Tier 2 override, Kor said finally, each word clipped tight with an anger that Mara understood, distantly, was not really aimed at her, but at the position she'd put him in. It will proceed. I want it on record, Commander, that I object to the manner in which this operation has been conducted, that I consider your actions a serious breach of command authority, and that this conversation will be the first exhibit in whatever proceeding follows once these children are safely aboard. Do you understand me? Completely, Admiral. Good. Then get back to your ship and make sure the corridor you mapped is still worth the cruiser I just authorized. The channel closed. Osen let out a breath he'd apparently been holding the entire exchange. Was that good or bad? That was somebody doing the right thing while making very sure everyone knew he didn't want to, Mara said. In my experience, that's the most common way the right thing actually gets done. Come on. We've got a ship to get ready for. She spent the next 20 minutes doing the only useful thing she could, given that she had no capacity to carry anyone and no way to speed the thread right's approach. She organized. She split the children into extraction groups by size and mobility, oldest and steadiest paired with youngest and most frightened, taught the ones old enough to understand it how the umbilical transfer would work, so it wouldn't be a mystery when the moment came, and made Inez, 9 years old and apparently unshakable, her official second in command of counting, because a child who had spent 31 hours keeping a tally on a bulkhead deserved to be the one still keeping it when help finally arrived. You're not going to leave, right? Inez asked, small hand fisted in the sleeve of Mara's suit. Even if the ship doesn't come in time? I'm not leaving, Mara said, and meant it in a way that would matter more than she yet knew. The proper ship, a Yurthal-crewed heavy recovery cruiser called the Threadright, hastily reassigned under a Tier 2 override that had, against every institutional habit Thrain possessed, finally cleared Ministry signatory in just under 3 hours instead of 8, because Thrain had attached Mara's footage directly to the override request and dared anyone at Ministry level to watch 82 children rationing air and still refuse, arrived with 11 minutes of corridor left. It was not in the end a clean rescue. The Threadright's mass was larger than Mara's precisely flown scout wake, and the pilot, competent, careful, doing everything by a plan built from Mara's own corridor data, still clipped the outer edge of the shear field on final approach, close enough that for 4 seconds every alarm on both ships screamed in unison, and the ambient moan of the choir spiked into something closer to a shriek. It didn't trigger a second Varen. It came close enough that Mara, monitoring from inside the Meridian Hales dormitory with 82 children around her, felt the Rex structure groan under a stress it hadn't carried in 31 hours of drifting. And for those 4 seconds she understood exactly how thin the margin Thrain had described actually was, and how easily 4% could have become the whole moon after all. The margin held. The thread right stabilized, extended its recovery umbilical, and began pulling children across in ordered groups of 6. Oldest first, because Osen Pharaoh insisted on it, and Mara backed him without hesitation. 4-year-olds last because someone needed to carry them, and Mara meant to be the one still standing on this wreck when that happened. She was not, in the end, the one still standing. At Extraction Group 11 of 14, with 66 children already aboard the Threadright and 16 left in the dormitory, a secondary structural failure, the central section's last intact bulkhead, stressed past its tolerance by the shear spike 4 minutes earlier, buckled without warning, and the dormitory's remaining breathable atmosphere began venting through a crack Mara's suit sensors read as fatal within 90 seconds for anyone not sealed. 16 children. 2 working suits, hers and one salvaged from the Rex stores, sized for an adult. 90 seconds. She did not do the math the way the engine would have. She didn't weigh 16 lives against one, or calculate the odds of her own survival against the certainty of theirs. She got the 4 youngest children, Inez among them, her small fist still full of the fabric of Mara's sleeve until the last possible second, sealed inside her own suit's emergency cocoon, a function built for cargo, never rated for 4 small bodies at once, and she shoved the salvaged adult suit onto Osen Pharaoh and told him to lead the other 11 through the umbilical at a dead run, no stopping, no looking back, and she stayed in the venting dormitory with no suit of her own, because there hadn't been time to find or build a 5th. "I'm not leaving without you," Osen said. And for a moment the 14-year-old who had held 82 lives together for 31 hours looked finally like exactly what he was. A child. Terrified. Refusing to abandon the one adult who hadn't abandoned him. "You're not leaving without me," Mara said, forcing a steadiness into her voice her body no longer felt. "You're leaving with 4 kids who need somebody strong enough to carry them, and I need you to be that somebody for the next 60 seconds, because I promised Inez I wasn't going anywhere and I intend to still be here when this ship gets fixed enough to prove it. Go, Osen." Now, he went. The last thing she saw of him was the back of an oversized suit disappearing into the umbilical with 11 children ahead of him, and not one look back, because he had understood, in the way only someone who had already carried too much for too long could understand, that the kindest thing he could do for her in that moment was exactly what she'd asked. The last thing she remembered clearly, before the cold took the edges off her vision, was the amber emergency light flickering across a wall someone had scratched a tally into. 82 marks, 1 for each child who'd made it this far, and beneath it, faint, the sound of the choir's moan easing back into something almost gentle, as if the wreck itself had exhaled. She woke in the Threadright's medical bay to Thrain's projection sitting, uncharacteristically, in an actual chair instead of standing, and to the specific disorienting quiet of a room where every alarm has already stopped. "You are missing 2 fingers on your left hand to frost necrosis," Thrain said without preamble, which Mara understood after 9 years to be Yurthal, for I am relieved and do not know how to say so. "You will not fly a standard cockpit interface again without recalibration surgery. You were without suit integrity for 140 seconds before extraction reached you, which the medical staff describe as a number they would prefer not to discuss in front of the patient." "How many?" Mara said. Her voice came out as gravel. "How many made it?" 82. Thrain let that sit a moment. "All of them, Commander." Osen Pharaoh did not stop running. Neither, apparently, did anyone behind him. "Inez has asked 11 times when she may see you, and has been told 11 times that you are resting, and has, I am reliably informed, believed this exactly 0 times. Despite everything, something in Mara's chest loosened at that, enough to almost be a laugh. Let her in. When you are stronger. Kessa, let her in. Thrain's projection was quiet for a moment. You should know that the containment field held. There was no cascade. The moon on the ring's far arc is, as of this hour, entirely unaware how close it came to a second Varan, and it is possible it will remain unaware indefinitely, because the Ministry's instinct, even now, even after this, will be to bury the near miss along with everything else it has buried for 3 centuries. Not this time, Mara said. No, Thrain agreed, and something in her voice suggested she had already decided the same thing alone, in whatever quiet Yurthal used for the kind of reckoning that changes a career. Not this time. The Ministry inquiry that followed took 4 months, and Mara sat through most of it from a recovery ward, her left hand rebuilt, but never quite the same, listening to senior officials use words like precedent and institutional risk, and unauthorized incursion in the same tone Thrain had once used for resource determination. She had expected to lose her commission. She had, if she was honest with the version of herself that had flown into the choir with 91% fuel and no real plan for getting out, been prepared to lose it and consider the trade fair. What she had not expected was Osen Pharaoh, testifying by recorded statement because the Ministry would not permit a 14-year-old refugee to appear in person, describing the tally he'd scratched into the dormitory wall. 1 mark for every child still breathing. Updated hourly for 31 hours because counting felt like the only thing left that was still ours to do. And the room going silent in a way that 4 months of expert testimony about shear gradients and containment fields had never once achieved. She had not expected Inez, 9 years old, submitting her own statement against every recommendation of the Ministry's child welfare counselors, to describe, in the plain, unadorned language only a 9-year-old could manage, what it had felt like to be told by a form field that she was unrecoverable, and then to be told an hour later, by an actual person standing in the room, that she was not. She had not expected Thrain, called as the Ministry's own witness to depart from her prepared statement and tell the inquiry, in careful, unhurried Yurthal formality, that the engine's classification system had never once been designed to answer the only question that actually mattered in a rescue, which was not what does this cost, but what does it cost the people who have to live afterward with what we chose not to try, and to go further than her prepared remarks allowed, disclosing in front of the full inquiry panel and against direct instruction from 2 Ministry superiors the existence of the containment field, and an approximate count of prior unrecoverable rulings that may have concealed the same secret, an act that ended within the week in her own formal censure, and the quiet beginning of a separate, far larger investigation that would occupy the Ministry for years. I was asked why I chose to disclose it, Thrain told Mara afterward in the recovery ward, her projection standing this time, straight-backed, in the particular posture Yurtle used when they had made peace with a costly decision. I told them the truth. I disclosed it because Commander Voss asked me a question I did not want to answer, and answering it honestly cost me a career I had spent 11 years building, and refusing to answer it honestly would have cost 82 children their lives and cost me something I no longer knew how to name until I nearly lost it. I chose the cost I could live with. They're going to censure you for it, Mara said. It wasn't a question. They already have. I am no longer Fleet Liaison Administrator. I have been reassigned to an archival post cataloging historical treaty amendments, which is, I am given to understand, intended as a quiet professional death rather than an active punishment. The Ministry rarely dismisses people outright when it can simply make certain nothing they say afterward reaches anyone who matters. Thrain paused, and something in the set of her projected shoulders suggested she had rehearsed the next part. I want you to know that if given the same choice again with full knowledge of the cost, I would disclose it again. I spent 11 years believing that patience and procedure were the same thing as integrity. You have shown me they are not always the same thing, Commander, and I find I cannot go back to believing they are, however much simpler that belief made my life. For what it's worth, Mara said, I'd rather have you cataloging treaty amendments and telling the truth than sitting in the liaison chair and protecting a secret that's already cost 40,000 people once. "It is worth a great deal, actually," Thrain said, and there was something almost like warmth in the careful Yurthal formality of it. "More than the Ministry currently understands. I suspect that will change. Institutions are slow, Commander, but they are not permanently blind, and 82 children who were told they did not matter enough to save are, at this moment, alive in a Concord medical facility, being interviewed by inquiry staff who cannot look at Inez Deverell's tally marks and pretend the old system was merely imperfect. It was not imperfect. It was working exactly as designed. That is a harder thing for an institution to sit with, and I believe it will sit with it for longer than anyone currently expects." And she had not expected the ruling when it came to include, buried in 600 pages of procedural amendment that would take the Ministry another year to fully implement, a new classification tier, inserted above unrecoverable in the engine's decision architecture, requiring any ruling involving confirmed survivors to root through mandatory human or Yurthal review before the file could close. They called it, in the dry administrative language such things always got named in Tier 0, contested determination, tested. Everyone who'd been in the choir called it something else. Osen Farrow started it, in an interview he gave 2 years later, grown into someone steadier than 14 had any right to expect, describing the wall he'd scratched a tally into as the moment he'd stopped believing the paperwork and started believing the person standing in the room with them. He called it the Wren Clause. Mara Voss never flew a standard cockpit again. She flew search and rescue anyway, from a modified interface built around what her left hand could still do, and she kept, framed in her quarters where the recalibration surgeons had told her not to keep reminders of the incident that caused it, a single photograph. 82 children and one 14-year-old with an adult suit 3 sizes too large, standing in the Threadrights recovery bay, alive, uncounted by any engine, recovered by a decision nobody in the file had been authorized to make. Underneath it, she'd had someone etch a line she'd started saying to every crew she trained after that. Every time a console lit up with a word designed to close a door on someone still breathing behind it. Unrecoverable is not a fact. It's a decision someone made not to look harder. Look harder. Inez wrote to her every year on the anniversary, first as a child still learning to spell commander correctly, then, slowly, as someone growing into the specific, stubborn competence of a person who had learned very young that being counted mattered, and had decided to spend her life making sure other people were. She was, by the time she turned 19, 3 semesters into a Concord officer track in search and rescue systems design, with a stated career goal, printed without irony on her academy application, of making the word unrecoverable obsolete. Osen went a different direction. One that surprised nobody who had watched him hold a dormitory together for 31 hours on nothing but stubbornness and a scratched tally. He joined search and rescue outright, trained under Mara's own modified interface program, and flew his first solo mission 4 years to the day after the Meridian hail went dark, into a debris field considerably smaller than the choir, but marked, in the engine's now revised architecture, with the same 11 characters that had once nearly ended his life. He did not sign the stand down either. Nobody who had trained under Mara Voss ever quite learned how. 9 years after she'd signed the form that ended her daughter's file, Mara Voss had finally stopped believing that the people who wrote the rules knew something she didn't. What she'd learned instead, in a dying dormitory with 16 children and 90 seconds, was smaller and larger than that all at once. The rules only ever knew what somebody was willing to tell them, and sometimes the only honest way to answer a spreadsheet was to fly past its edge and refuse, with your whole body if it came to that. To let a word decide the truth before a person had gone and checked. 83 children had been marked unrecoverable. 82 of them grew up,